A very good evening to everyone present here, and welcome to the third and final session of the Data Conclave from Sambodhi. I'm Rashi and work with the research team here. I will be your host for today. I couldn't be more excited to welcome you all to today's session, which is on the art of storytelling, from numbers to narratives, telling a compelling data story. My excitement is not without reason. As a researcher, I have often struggled with several questions while writing my reports, such as how do I make my analysis more accessible to a non statistical audience? How can I write my reports in a way that it does not put our clients to sleep? Or how do I make sure that our reports genuinely make an impact for our clients and stakeholders? I know that these are not just my questions, but bigger questions that we share as a community. The answer to them luckily boils down to getting the art of data storytelling right. I'd like to welcome Kadambari, Vice President at Sambodhi, but also on a more informal note, someone to whom the art of storytelling comes so naturally. Luckily for us at Sambodhi, we constantly benefit from her humor. She makes her the perfect candidate to lead us and set context for our discussion. Kadambari, over to you.
Thanks, Rashi. Good evening, everyone, and hello. Hope everyone is well and cheery. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to today's session on data storytelling. We've all been witness to this explosion of data, whether it's, volume or velocity or variety. And in fact, according to a study which was put out by the IDC, we collectively generated about 64 zettabytes of data in 2020, and data generation and replication is set to grow by 23% right up to 2025. Now, it is a data conclave after all, and I couldn't resist sort of throwing some numbers out there. But data which is unaccompanied by insights, and these are, insights to support better program design and implementation, or insights to influence policy making for more transformative developmental change, is all rather pointless. And we at Sambodhi over the last 17 years, have worked with implementers, worked with funders, philanthropic foundations, with governments, providing them with data, supporting them to make more informed decisions or more strategic investments for social impact. And being kind of obsessed with data, we're also constantly talking about at a 30,000 feet, how can we strengthen, the data ecosystem, or at a more minutiae micro level, how do we better capture the sentiments and perspectives of the last mile audience? And I think the last 2 days of Data Conclave summed up some of what we've been grappling with in terms of issues and ideas quite beautifully. But I think one unequivocal learning for us over the past several years has been that people do not value data. They don't use it. They're not inspired to act or to trigger change if they don't relate to the data, and if they're not engaging with the data, and they're not immersed with the data. And I think this sort of happens when people are excited about sharing stories and insights around the data. So the bottom line essentially has been that, we have these fancy skills of creating spreadsheets and maintaining databases and running algorithms. And I think that all of these skills, if they're not accompanied with an extremely nuanced skill of communicating the story that the data is throwing up and communicating it lucidly and in a compelling fashion, I think we as researchers and evaluators and analysts have kind of lost the plot. And I cannot sort of reiterate enough that, I think storytelling is an art, and it's a pretty nuanced art, because you need to have the skill to be able to make raw, I think, data and numbers come alive, right? And I think, like any good novelist, a good storyteller, in the data context, equally needs to sort of unleash people's imagination, help them, visualize, make them opinionated, make them argumentative, And I think that's sort of the power of storytelling. So I'm very excited today because it's not just about the numbers. It's about delving into the power of storytelling and how I think the amalgamation of data and visualization and narratives kind of comes together seamlessly to what can, I think, create a really impactful, powerful story of what change has been and where we are faltering, and what do we have to look forward to. And I think it's a critical piece of the data story. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. And very warm welcome to our panelists. And again, thanks ever so much, all of you, for taking the time out and joining us. And over to you, Rashi.
Thank you, Kadambari, for that lovely beginning to set context in our discussion. Accompanying us on this much awaited discussion are three stellar panelists. Our first panelist is Deepthy. Deepthy is a communications and learning facilitator at Urgent Action Fund for Women's Rights, Asia and Pacific. Our second panelist is Lyndee Prickitt, Director of Village Square, India. She is also the director or editor of Digital Fables. Our third panelist is Tanya Bhattacharya, who is a business storyteller and story coach at Storywallahs. Last but not the least, I'd like to welcome Anubrata, our moderator, who is Assistant Vice President at Sambodhi and leads our communications vertical. Having worked with her for so long, Anubrata, confession long due, I often think of her as a mediator or peacekeeper of sorts. She constantly strives hard to balance the organization's creative needs while upholding the dignity of the rigorous research we do. She will be moderating our session today. With that, welcome Anubrata, over to you.
Thank you, Rashi. I love the idea of myself as a peacekeeper. Let me start with this. When the Avengers movie came out, it raised $8 billion at the box office. When the Justice League premiered, it only grossed about $660 million. The Avengers had sequel after sequel and prequel after prequel made, and Justice League fell off after like the first and or the second movie. So why do the Avenger movies outsell and outperform the Justice League in every category? The answer is probably in the story behind the films. The MCU or the Avengers characters had character arcs. They were flawed and multi-dimensional characters. People could relate to them. They were like well-rounded people. The Justice League had characters who were only heroes in name. We knew who they were, but they didn't have a backstory or enough personalization. People couldn't resonate with them. Believe it or not, the same concepts are valid for data stories and data analytics. Data will be called on in meetings to solve problems the same way superheroes are called on to save the city. If our data doesn't have a backstory or context, or if the way it's presented is too complicated, it can cause sensory overload in the audience or worse, sedate them. You can lose your audience just like the Justice League. On that note, let's start. But before we start our discussion, may I request Deepthy, Lyndee, and Tanya to, can you just describe yourselves in 50 words or less within the world of storytelling? Deepthy, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so my elevator pitch goes like this. I am a storyteller, yes, but I'm also a pattern seeker. So when I see data, I'm always looking for what are the patterns that emerge, and then I'm looking at audiences. So yes, I would call myself a pattern seeker who is a passionate storyteller. Over to you, Tanya.
Oh, thank you. I love the words that you used. Pattern seeker. So brilliant. Well, I'm Tanya Bhattacharya, and I am a storyteller. I'm a story coach. I believe that everything that unfolds around us is potentially a story. We just need to be first-class noticers to be able to see it. I think it's quite similar to what Deepthy said, pattern seeker. I believe that noticing helps you get stories. So I think we're all the same at heart. So that's about me. Lyndee.
Thank you, Tanya and Deepthy. I am a journalist and a mother, and that means that I'm always either asking why or being asked why, which naturally makes me a storyteller. I want to know about people. I see numbers in my head and eyes glaze over. Behind every number is a real person. What do we spend our time, whether it's bedtime or dinner time or breakfast time, doing as humans? How are we different from the animals? We think it's rationale. It's not. It's stories. We tell each other stories. That's how humans exist. That's how we're different. That's how we've evolved. Whether it's the story of believing that a coin that might just be made of copper is really worth something. It's a story. That's who we are. And I love finding the story behind numbers and behind the coin and making these things come alive. And I guarantee that if you were to go away in a few minutes and think about what I said, probably it's the coin that's going to come into your head because it's a visual reference. And that's the key to storytelling. But I'll share that later.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyndee. Thank you, Deepthy. Thank you, Tanya. So why don't we start with this? So here's an observation. After undertaking an entire study, it can be often tempting to want to show your audience everything, like all the analysis we have done, all the charts, or the graphs, or the tables we have generated, as either evidence of all the hard work we have put in, or even to show that our analysis is robust. How do we resist that urge of oversharing? How do we focus on understanding what's important and what's not? Why don't we start with Tanya?
And, I think this is a quick, faint reference to what Anubrata told me when we started, when we met just before the session began. Describe yourself in 50 words or less. And my remark was that I'm a storyteller. How do you expect me to use less words? I think it's easier to use more words than to use less. There's always a temptation to say more. But to resist the temptation to overshare is to identify what would stick best. And that stands true for data as well. Sometimes we also undershare, in fact, Anubrata. So for example, if we are going to share or use big numbers, like 64 zettabytes of data has been produced, and my mind's boggling, and I'm wondering what is 64 zettabytes, because I don't know, I can't visualize 64 zettabytes. So how do you strike the balance of undersharing and oversharing is to probably look for comparisons and compare it to something physical. If it's digital data, if it were to be saved in a space, how much space would it take? So now you can imagine exactly how humongous 64 zettabytes of data would look like. So striking that, it's the sweet spot in between.
Deepthy, why don't we kind of toss it to you?
Well, I would say what I really keep in mind is who my audience is. So the other day, I was telling my colleagues that I have a very brief report. It's just this look of incredulity on her face. And she said, just 16 pages? And I think it's one of the things that I constantly evangelize, that we need to look at who we are crafting the story for. So there are several people who liking that they want from the trailer. They don't have the bandwidth to sit through a feature film, however good it is. So it's not enough to say that I have a brilliant feature film. It's got the best cinematography. It's got the storyline is tight. I mean, if people don't want to watch it, then you need to create a cracking trailer as well. And perhaps you also need to figure out how to advertise. So to me, storytelling or packaging that brilliant piece of research that you've done with everything, the hyperlinking that critical piece of big research that you have and bringing it down into bite sizes, into chunks, which are easy to be digested by the audience that you're looking for. So I always believe that in this time where everyone's scrolling, everyone's moving their finger this way and that.
I think that audience is the number one thing you should be asking yourself. Who is this for, and what do they need to know? What is their takeaway, or the new phrase, what's the call to action that you're trying to get? What do you want out of it? And it can be a lot of different things. And the trick sometimes, or rather the hard thing is when you've got one report to write and you have several different audiences. Government bureaucrats who might be releasing money to you, maybe some foreign funders. Those are two totally different audiences, and sometimes you might even have to think one size does not fit all. what might be good for one audience is going to be different for another audience. And you have to think about how the audience is going to react to it. Once you know who your audience is and you've decided if you're going to go for one size fits all or you're going to have something tailored for each, and sometimes, by the way, that's easier than trying to do the one size fits all. Sometimes it's easier to do a 2-page brief for one audience and a different audience and a different audience than one big overarching thing, trying to hope that everybody understands it. That's what Shakespeare did, by the way. It's really hard to do. So I think once you know who your audience is, think really brutally, what do you want from them? Is it that you want them to fund you more? Is it that you want them to think you're amazing? Is it that you want them to go away and think, this scheme did not work because of a shortage of A, B, and C? You have to be very specific about what your mission is, and then everything else can tie into that. And of course, as a journalist, it's that I want you to keep reading. So I have to keep making it interesting. That might be your mission as well. But if it's not, you've got to think, what is my mission? Who's my audience? How can I tailor it to them? Then all the other excess stuff can go.
Often we work in projects where we are writing for like anyone who's interested. So how do we kind of set up ourselves up for success in that case? Tanya, I would like to hear from you. How do you think we should kind of approach our project or our report when we are kind of communicating for anyone who's interested?
That's an interesting question, that does storytelling run the risk of a possible interpreter's bias, and what could be ways to address it? And I agree with you, Abhishek, there's always this risk because we don't know what experiences our audience have had or readers have had or listeners have had. So the bias will always be there, and that's the risk that we run in all kinds of communication. But what really helps is, and you in fact answered it more or less here yourself when you said that, when a story which is expected by the implementer of the actual story that the data tells. So actual story that the data tells, I'm going to pick up what Lyndee had said about, there's a data always has a human in the background. So if you're picking up a real human story, even if there are lots of biases that our audience or listeners or readers might have, when we have actual case studies and real stories of real people, it becomes easier to visualize what their lives were like, or what their troubles, tribulations, or what their sacrifices, or what their achievements were like. And that's where it can also be an eye-opener. So sometimes sharing stories can actually break a bias, or it will also confirm a bias. And that's the risk that we will always continue to run. But the idea is to give, to take people behind the scenes and show them something that they can't imagine. So when somebody, for example, let's take a latest example. So there was shootout that happened in US just yesterday in a school, very unfortunate event. Now, why do things like that happen? I can throw numbers at you, and I could say that 4.6 American children today are exposed to guns at home, which are handy and they're unlocked. Can you imagine 4.6 million Americans? That's a huge number. That's the entire population of Kolkata here in India. Now imagine every citizen of Kolkata, irrespective of their gender, age, educational background, social status, everyone has access to a gun which is unlocked and it's loaded. Now, anytime there's a disagreement or a fight that happens, it's so easy to access that gun and shoot out. Irrespective of what bias I may have, I may come from a bias that, well, guns are great for personal security and safety. But when we help people visualize and understand how, what the impact of that number is when you have 4.6 million people who have access to it, wouldn't the chances of school shootings, suicides, and killing of family members just go crazy high? So stringent laws need to be put in place. In US, in the last 4.5 months, that's at the start of 2020, since then to now, about 27 school shootings have happened. If you look at the average, that comes to 6 shootouts in schools alone every single month. That's a shockingly high number. So when someone has to drive home a point, however strong a lobby might be, when we share examples, when we talk about, use certain techniques, it could be a human story, it could be comparison, we are able to drive home a point better and hopefully break that bias and get people to look at things differently, lending them a lens.
Thank you. Thank you. That was quite wisely put. Deepthi, you were making a point on like how do we control the urge of oversharing? Over to you.
Well, continuing on that, I really like what Tanya's point on numbers. To me, what I think really works with audiences now is being able to tap into the kind of pop culture that they consume. So what I have realized through work is the way to make anything interesting or engaging is to be able to talk in the language of the audiences that you want to reach. So if we were to write research in say this the same way, 1 out of 5, the moment I see that, I know this is written by someone who engages or works with research organizations. The moment I see it couched as starting with an example, so for instance talking about children who've died in that horrific shooting accident. And when the story begins from there, then I know it's written by a journalist. So these are the biases that I work with. And these are things that I often notice. But what I see as compelling storytelling these days with good research are things like the stuff I shared with you, how Economist crunches data and Economist is able to bring it together in accessible bites, in layman language, so that you're impacted by it. Ultimately, the policymakers or, even when we talk about data-driven decision making, the policymakers we want to influence are ultimately humans, are people who consume their information or data in a certain way. So if we can make accessible what we think are, say, in my the way I look at it is, what are your top 3 things that you want to convey? That needs to come into the brief. Don't put all your pie charts out. Yes, you've done a lot of work, and that needs to be hyperlinked. So it's the magic of hyperlinking. It's the magic of having, clouds available to put all your data into. Put your big data there. I shouldn't be talking big data in this, please, this loosely. But put your data and analysis there. But use hooks, and like Lyndee did, at the very beginning, talking about the coin. Use teasers to keep your audience hooked. So those are my key suggestions.
Right. So Deepthi, I have a follow-up question for you. So there are reports which are where we are required to use graphs and charts. What do we do then? Like when we are required to use too many graphs and charts, and like every analysis has to be supported by a graph or a chart or some visualization. How do we make our visualization smart? How do we think about that?
First, think of, do you want to visualize everything that has been done? So that's your first battle with all the researchers that you have who are fighting to include every little bit of information they have hard fought for. I would say that the best place for documents which are more than 25 pages is online. So create a database where those who really want to dig into data understand it, and that's usually your fellow practitioners, your peers. That's the place to put it. It's not meant to be produced or created into that form of storytelling. Storytelling, in essence, has to be a story which is finite. It has a start, a middle, and an end. And you need to keep it within those confines. And you don't need to say everything. While some descriptors are great, you don't need to have like over descriptions to kind of make a point that, hey, I've done my homework. I know it. And it's actually, I feel, the problem of researchers being in the academia world where everyone's asking about what you've not spoken about, not the merit of what you're presenting before it. So to me, interesting storytelling is where you influence the people, you engage with them, you tease them with your argument. And the way you said, if there is a big research, the first thing I do is I ask if it can be given to a good copy editor to condense the copy, pick out at least 3 to 4 key points that you want to present before a policymaker or, to the audience that you've identified, and then also make a brief. because you have exactly 30 seconds. It's why we create elevator pitches, why we say you need boilerplates, why we say that, there is a certain way that you need to communicate who you are and what you can provide with the research that you have in minimal time. So there are multiple ways of doing it. There are multiple formats. And I think what we all need is trust in the storyteller and flexibility to be able to give up your pet research into the hands of these storytellers and trust them when they say that this is what can work with the audience.
I just wanted to add to what Deepthy said, putting the trust in storytellers. And one of the comments, in fact, in the chat window were about, that if there's a study, will it take away the credibility of the study if we tell a story, and do people undermine stories? That yes, it is very likely to happen, because a lot of times still in the world, story is equated to make believe something which is, like false or imaginary, outrageously creative and far away from the truth. I think once we understand that while, when we use the word story, something that comes to mind is probably novels, books, movies, etc., and the stories that we've heard growing up. But it's the art that matters, and if we focus on the art and why it works, anything like Lyndee was saying, anything which has survived in the world thus far has survived because of a story which was told to us. But all of those stories, when they're anchored in truth, so marry it with the idea of researchers and what data points you've investigated, what survey you have done, what kind of big dashboard numbers do you have. But if it is anchored in truth, and if it can be visualized well, if it can be explained in a layman language, it would be so much better. So sometimes we fall into the trap of being, wanting to come across as very as subject matter experts, and which is why we might want to use words which are big fancy, but maybe not easily processed, because these are complicated long sentences and very winding. So how do we speak, do humans speak, be able to connect with people just to help them understand what the numbers mean, or what led to the numbers looking the way they do? Stories help people understand. Stories are great transportation devices. In fact, there are two kinds of transportation devices that humans were born with, if we were lucky. One is our pair of legs, so that we could walk and go. But in especially the kind of work that, the social sector space, people in social sector space are doing, change makers are doing, there's so many places in the world which are inaccessible to us. If I can't really transport myself and physically go there, you've got the numbers for me. The data could be extremely credible, and I don't doubt it. It should be, it has to be. I'm putting my trust in you as a data researcher, as someone who's bringing the data to me. But tell me what the data means. And I think that's the biggest gap that exists today. People cannot imagine what the numbers mean, or or what the impact is on, like Vikas was asking earlier, that do I sometimes have just one view, people contesting the data, it's only you've collected it from one perspective. Then can I talk about, because nothing happens in isolation. We are all connected, no man's an island, and no number's an island either. So if there is a number that exists, while there is one particular community that you may be talking about, one particular sector you may be talking about, but if any change that happens, there's a law of interdependencies. Something else gets triggered and impacted. And good storytellers are able to point, look, investigate, and then tell the story of it, so that we can share the impact and then bring people into the fold. Because data is not data. Data is people. Data is in lives. Data is impact. Data is change. And that's what numbers should be ideally doing.
So before I move on to the next question, I see there are a few questions here. So how about this? In the spirit of making it participatory and interactive, we at the end of the major discussion, we can ask the participants to switch on their mic and probably ask the question themselves. So we'll go through I have a few more questions. We'll go through them first, and then we'll delve into the Q&A. So my second question is let's start with Lyndee first. So as communication practitioners, we often hear things like the language of the report needs to be academic or technical. So how do you strike a balance between telling a story while keeping the language academic or technical?
Okay, so again, it's who is your audience? If your audience is funders or an academic research, other practitioners, fine, use academic language. But Most people don't speak like that. So I think you've got to try and, as you say, strike a balance between the two of those. I have a couple of little hacks that I want to give, one that answers this question and one that answers one of the questions that was on the chat earlier. As of course, as a journalist, we're writing for a very wide audience, but I think this is an applicable thing for anyone writing. Rather than think about your boss, who maybe you're trying to impress with your big words or your reams of data, or your funder who you're hoping thinks that you're so erudite and smart, when you're trying to get a message across, try instead of thinking of your grandmother. Your grandmother, who is a smart woman, but maybe doesn't have time for your long academic spiel. Maybe she got her degree in something completely else. How do you tell your grandmother why this program for solar panels is the best program ever if only more states would implement it? How do you tell it in the most simple terms? If you can think about how you would say, sell it to your grandmother to keep her interested, or grandfather, then you can do that as your outline. That's your basic outline, beginning, middle, end, just like any story. Whether, as I said earlier, whether you're sitting around a dinner table or you're telling your child the story late at night, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's the way you should think about your reports, whether they're 2 pages or 60 pages. How do you hook them in? Because grandma isn't interested unless you hook her in. And then I have a second hack, which addresses one of the questions about when you have so much data, how can you just tell a story? Well, one really good cheat to that is if you are starting with the story of, okay, the villager who walks 2 kilometers every day just to get a jug of water and has to go back and forth. You can tell that story about that person and how the new water pump in her village made it so much easier. That's one story, one beginning, middle, end narrative arc that grandma understands. And then now you want to impress your bosses and your fundraisers, but you've got them in. Then you can say her story, imagine her story 1.3 million times, because there are 1.3 million people like Shakti who has the same story. That's how you make the numbers come alive. And then you can have a nice pie chart. And instead of the pie chart just being, blue and green and orange, your pie chart, or whatever your graphic is, can also have a human element. It can have little people on it, so that now you've put Shakti in words at the beginning. Now you have your pie chart with your numbers. People are beginning to put 2 and 2 together. As you go on through your report, then you can pack it with your academic talk, pack it with your data, impress your bosses and your fundraisers, but you've hooked them in. And then you have to find that balance between, once you hook them in with simple language, then you can keep your academic speak, because I know that's what you asked me, Anubrata. How do you marry that to? Always start with the short, succinct, catchy phrase or story or analogy or headline thesis, and then you can add more data information to it.
I have no grouse against pie charts or bar graphs, but what I do think is there are so many different ways of storytelling. Again, if you notice, all of us have gone into that little space which researchers inhabit of thinking of reports. The 2D reports, the ones that are printed, the ones that, need to be flipped through, and the ones that you need to smell. In this day of digital storytelling, there are so many other different ways of engaging, with the audiences that you want to engage with. So to me, I think it's time to give the pie charts and bar graphs a rest, primarily because of that. I think the reason why you need to engage with people who are storytellers, or who consider themselves as storytellers, is because they have innovative ways of presenting the same bits. And we sometimes, I think it's this inherited approach that I feel, which is also about, I want the West to acknowledge, the Western publications to accept it, the West to acknowledge my research is robust. So we've accepted a lot of norms from different places, as these are the norms that we will go by. But I think innovative storytelling works everywhere. So like I was explaining in the chat to one of the comments, in feminist philanthropy space is very small, but there's a lot of path-breaking research that's happening. There's a lot of South-South learning that's happening. And one of the things we are learning in South-South is participatory stuff. You cannot, if you want papers written on what is happening, what is truly happening on the ground, then you cannot expect us to, figure out what is the literature available in the West that we can work with, that we can reference. You need to use storytelling as a primary source of data. And that storytelling needs to be accepted for what it puts forward, and then start a round of conversation. So there are multiple ways in which, so I guess this brings it to the quant call eternal struggle as well. But I feel that there is need for us to accept new and different ways of storytelling, and the data that's thrown up by interactions and engagements. That's the reason I was laughing.
Tanya, I have a follow-up question. Building on what Deepthy just shared, research, people who are invested in research, they need to collaborate with storytellers. But can researchers also be storytellers? I mean, what I really mean to ask is is storytelling an inherent skill, or can it be learned? I mean, if I don't have those chops, how do I go about learning that?
I think the first barrier to overcome is to realize and accept and embrace the fact that we are all storytellers. We were born storytellers. We've been telling stories to save our skin in school. We've been telling stories at workplace. We've been telling stories all the time. It's just that when we don the hat of a researcher or someone who's a data analyst, we think, oh, now I just have to think in numbers and I can't tell a story. So as soon as there is this crossover that happens, or this, we end up embracing the fact that we are all storytellers, we now start looking for how do I tell stories. Yes, it's an acquired skill, but it's something that can be learned. To become a better storyteller, the very first thing that anyone needs to do is to start listening to good stories. In your own space, in your own industry, look at who's telling good stories. Why does it stick? What value does it bring that other people want to listen to these speakers, to these storytellers? And when we start adapting and listening to good stories, then we can, create our own. Of course, you can always seek help. There are people like Deepthy, Lyndee, myself. There are so many others out there in the world who are story enthusiasts. Yeah. So I would never dare to call myself an expert, because I think it's such a deep, beautiful art and science that we would have amazing arrogance to say that I'm an expert. I don't think I am. But I think when all of us who are deeply enthusiastic about storytelling, we may have learned certain skills, techniques, partner with someone, sit with them, get them to coach you, help you look at your numbers, re-look at your numbers and data, give you some tips and tricks on how can I say the same thing in a story format. And the more we practice, the better we get. None of us were born running marathons. None of us were born cooking amazing food in the kitchen. We all learned that through practice. So first, pick up the skill, find someone to coach you, and then keep practicing, keep at it. Watch what your audience is saying, what they're doing, how are they responding to you. Of course, when we, on any journey of change, the initial steps are the hardest. So if you're not doing so well, you get feedback, it was like a half-baked story, it didn't really go down very well. Write down why did it not go well, what did not connect. Have editing partners in your environment who can guide you and tell you this did not work for so and so reason and now what to do next. Yes, it's an acquired art, but it's something anybody can learn. They just need to be passionate about it and keen to learn it. And yes, they can.
Right. So on one hand, we're talking about data storytelling as a skill, but tell me, how do we look at it as an organizational culture? Can we look at data storytelling as an organizational culture? Deepthy?
I think yes. I think what you need is acceptance at the leadership level. And when you're negotiating your contracts with funders, ensuring there's money for communication in it. And communication should not be thought of as a support function. This has been something that I have been talking ad nauseum since I moved into the development sector. That, when you start thinking of communication as that last mile cleaning up, you have a report, it's been written, verbosely, and, you're thinking of comms as a team which, ensures that it's put in a nice format, or adding all the frills and ribbons, then you've lost your battle. But if you have a leadership that's as committed to saying good stories as the team that you have, a team of storytellers that you have, then you're on the right track. So for me, there's a lot of innovative ways in which you can present research. Podcasts. So many people are listening to podcasts right now, and the amount of research. Yes, Lyndee is saying, "Hey, I've been saying this for a while," but the amount of time that we have on our drives, etc. Have you ever putting a knowledge product out as a podcast with your research, with your funding proposal? The thing is, we are always trying to play safe. We are trying to play safe by saying we'll give you a 200-page report. It'll be fancily produced so that it meets your quality criteria. But we are not actually challenging ourselves to think of what are the different ways in which we can present the research that we have. And this is not something that you think last mile. This needs to be prepped for at the very beginning of a project. You need to have that budget put aside for storytellers to accompany you on the journey of research. And 3 times you do it, the 4th time the researcher becomes the storyteller automatically, because the researcher knows what it takes. So in a way, it's on the job training. By bringing in people like us to accompany researchers, you're understanding how we think. So when you're going on a field trip, having storytellers there, you will see what are the things that we are looking at. What is it that we think might appeal? These are discussions. This is the way that you evolve the story. So the story, again, is not something that you write, after everything's in place. It can be a work in progress as well. But for that, I think my submission is the leadership should be with you in terms of setting a budget, getting innovative storytellers on board, and giving them the license to experiment and explore.
This is music to my ears, by the way. But Tanya, you have been working with several organizations, helping them inculcate this as a culture. So how have you kind of helped them? How have you worked with these organizations?
In fact, it's interesting you asked that, Anubrata, because we don't just work with change makers and social sector organizations. A vast amount of work that we do is with corporates. And I've conducted workshops where we would be invited to run a 2-day workshop or a 1-day workshop on business storytelling or data storytelling. A leader would step in to say, well, to give a pep talk to the whole batch that, hey guys, please pay attention. It's something that you need to learn, etc., etc. And then they said, but don't come and tell me stories. And there was culture. So here you are investing so much of money and time. And can you imagine 20 people in a room? That's 20 man days spent if it's a 1-day workshop. That's a whole lot of money you're investing, apart from what you pay to people who come in to do these workshops and sessions for you. And I think the motivation to learn, to experiment, as Deepthy was saying, to make it safe to experiment, it goes away because they think, oh God, there's a big sigh that even if I learn something here, there's absolutely no point in trying this out, because when I go out and I tell this or use it in a meeting, I would not have audience in rapt attention. They would probably look at me critically. So I think what helps is starting from the top, getting the leaders to become better storytellers first, because everybody, any skill, any art, any behavior is learned through imitation and observation. So when leaders start to talk and share more stories, it becomes inspiring for the rest of the people that, hey, he or she does it and I want to be like that, or this is what's acceptable, hence I want to now become better myself. So always everything flows top down. So hence, leaders should become better storytellers before. Lyndee, what do you think?
I think everybody should be better storytellers, but I think everybody is. I'm reading a lot of the chat and it seems like there's some sort of hold on, we don't have these skills. How do we do this? I'm telling you, it's pretty native. When you're talking to somebody and their eyes start to glaze over, you've lost them, right? Most of us do. Okay, maybe there's a few of us who don't, but most of us do. We know when we're talking. And just on slightly, again, I want to impart some practical advice and knowledge, because I feel like there's a lot of sort of desperation for some practical juice here. Some people are like, well, how do we maintain that balance? let me just put it to you in a sort of journalistic way. When in print, when I was way back along when I was in journalism school and in print, first of all, they said never use an exclamation mark. Okay. So I also do some children's programming where I use exclamation marks all the time, but we know in adult world, we don't do that. They also said, be careful about having too much bold. Okay, so bold as in a headline or a subhead, right? If you wrote an article and you had a book, like every 2 sentences, you had something in bold, the bold would cease to be bold. It would no longer grab your attention, right? Therefore, it's about a balance. Of course, you can't just write a story. That's a memoir or a novel. But by the way, memoirs and novels do tend to stick a lot more with people than a 200-page report or book about that's got full of data. But it's a balance. So I think what we're all three saying is have a little bit of the storytelling and then back it up with some data. And then imagine you can start to feel people's eyes glaze over if it's something verbal that you're doing or if it's in text. You know that after 2 or 3 paragraphs of hard data, they're going to start to like reach for the coffee, doodle on their pen, look at their messages. Then you need to boom in. Now that could be with a photograph. It could be with a bit of multimedia. You could say, click here. It could be with some audio that jumps out at them that's embedded into a report. I'm all about multimedia, by the way. It could be with a different kind of story. You want to now change the narrative. You were talking about Shakti earlier. Now we need to talk about, the animal and the livestock so that you're keeping it fresh. You're not telling the same story over and over. The whole idea is to get a balance. And the reason I kind of like harp on about the grandma example is it's primitive within us to be storytellers. And if you do think about when are your colleagues' eyes glazing over, when are they starting to tap and look a bit bored, that's when you have to change things up. And it could be in a podcast, it could be in a video, or it could be me right now going on and on. I think it might be time to change it up and hand it back to Anubrata.
I wanted to switch a little bit, shift gears here. So how about talking about visualizations along with storytelling? For example, I know, Deepthy, you work a lot with visualizations, different visualizations. Lyndee, I know you experiment with so many different kind of media, and so does Tanya. So tell us a little bit about how well visualizations work with data storytelling, and how do we go about that? Like, we are not artists or illustrators, but how can we plan a good visual that will complement our data story?
There's something pleasing to everybody's eye. So even if you're not using say visuals, see visuals and creative language, or the visual language that you use, it comes with training and practice. So for instance, like Lyndee, I used to be a broadcast journalist. I grew up in newsrooms where I was asked to write these pithy texts and put out news stories with hardly any chance of figuring out everything. So there's a lot of drama involved in that. So drama is innate in how I think of everything, which is where I find joy. But that's personal about me. There are so many storytellers who are about minimalism, aesthetic. I am kitsch. I love kitsch. So I'm looking for the kitsch in the way storytelling is done. So there are multiple approaches, and what you need to figure out is what is the approach that works for your organizational identity. So if I were to give you an example, with Urgent Action Fund, where I lead comms and learning, it took over 3 years to build the persona of what Urgent Action Fund's communications would be. So we were very clear that, the human rights activists and defenders that we work with across Asia and the Pacific would not be represented via photos, or, we wouldn't have their case studies, presented as showcases. So, but their stories are important and they deserve to be told.
A couple of your work with us. So may I request Rashi to kind of project a couple of the illustration that Deepthy has helped plan?
So I could, what are we beaming, and depending on what we are showing, I could perhaps kind of give a rationale to why it was done this way. Okay. This is my answer to how to alternately represent bar graphs in pie charts. So this is an annual report. So this is an alternate way. It's a pleasing way, and you innately understand what we are trying to talk about. These are numbers, but instead of just looking at numbers, if you actually put things which are part of a visual language, you cannot just have like 50 pages of text and suddenly bring two fruits in. But if you were to create a visual language for your report and integrate, your maps and your pie charts and your graphs in this way, as you can see, there's a papaya to a pomegranate comparison. Now, if you look at them by itself, it doesn't really explain something. But to the audience, to your policymaker, it's a very interesting way of representing it. And then they start looking at what's mentioned against it. Anubrata, if we can go to the other example which I was using, which again represents what I was talking about in terms of how we created a visual identity, because we couldn't use photos or anecdotes or narratives that grantees would send us. We are a rapid response feminist fund, so as a grant maker, we took a decision as not to use anything which would compromise them in any way. So this is something else. This is a map representation. Scroll up, Rashi, and then you will come to. If you look at this map, okay, whenever it comes, if you look at the map that is there, you will see that all the grants that we have made across different geographies, across a time frame from the time that we came into being. So there are 4 different funds which are called as sister funds. So from 1997, we have mapped where. So if you move that little square that you see at 2009 around, you'll start seeing how it's a dynamic. It's a dynamic image where you can actually capture the story of our evolution with these dynamic dots. So it actually tells you about the work that we have done in different regions and how our work continues to grow. So I'm just giving you a few examples of how you can think about visualizing what you would, try and what you have to say in formats which are interactive, which are easy to engage with, and which actually tell a story without a single word being written. I'll throw it back to you, Anubrata.
Thank you, Deepthy. That was amazing. Also, Lyndee, you work, I know for a fact that you work with different kinds of media. What do you think? How do we go about planning visualizations for a data storyteller?
Everything should be visual. So even your words, text should be visual, because then that will get somebody to imagine it in their head and it'll lock in. But yes, especially with a younger audience today, you've really got to get visuals in there. I'm a big multimedia proponent. I really do believe in using multimedia and also being interactive. So if in your report you were able to try and grab some sort of points that you want to make and give it a visual reference. If you want to pull up my Be Dynamic slide, Rashi, then I can show you an example of how you could possibly do this. This was, number 5. We can start with number 5. This was something I did a while ago in response to India's sexual violence crisis. So this was called We Are Angry. It was a multimedia storytelling feat. It contains gobs and gobs of data points. Of course, it's 10 years old, so they're all 10 years ago. But within this structure, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that here I have both some visuals of various different protest banners that were up. Some of them were very provocative, and some were witty, and some were really emotional. And then you can see that there's a little bar under that where audio was also being played from different protests. And then when you were reading the text, I had hyperlinks to what you see on the left, which is stats. Okay, that's hardcore stats. There's nothing like storytelling about that, but they were supplementary. So I had pulled people in with the story. In fact, it is actually a fictional story that's underpinned by a lot of facts. I had pulled people in with the story and just embedded all these facts. If you go to the next slide, this is something I think that you guys could do. This was on the crying wolf on the right was an element to the story. And the different words, when you clicked on the words, say vendetta or fired maid, jilted, finance prostitute, then this came up on the one on the right-hand side. So these are wouldn't see this all on the screen at the same time. But this is just good old-fashioned interactive media, where when you click on a word, a pop-up window comes up. So it forces you to kind of wake up, read something. Yes, it's data, but you can see I am giving a storytelling in there. I'm telling a story. But you could easily do this with, say, a map of India, or maybe something more dynamic than a map of India. Maybe, again, let's go back to, you know, maybe an activist or solar panels or something, and you show the solar panels on each panel. You can get somebody to click, and that's fun because it makes them have to be aware, and they're not just being passive in reading. They click on a different solar panel and something else pops up, another data point. And then again, it's about balance. You interlace the data point with some stories as well. And I'll just really quickly, while you see, if you want to go to the next point, which is a completely different, the next one. This is the podcast that I do with my daughter. It's a weekly news podcast. But if you just go to the next screen as well, you can see that every episode we have a different visual cover art. We're trying to hook people in with a different visual feast, if you like, that sucks people in. They want to read it and tell about it. I wrote anecdotes and analogies because I was going to talk about that, but I can talk about that another time. But those are really important things to put in a report as well. But I'll pass it back over, because these are just some examples of how to use visuals or how to use multimedia to make things come alive. But it does go back to Deepthy's point, which is get your leadership from the beginning to give you some funding, because none of this is very easy. I saw somebody say, I wish Excel could do the math that Deepthy did. Yeah, so do I. None of this is necessarily cheap, but boy, it makes you stand out from the crowd. If you can produce a report that's multimedia or dynamic or interactive, people are going to sit up and go, wow, these people really know what they're doing. And they're this century, they're looking forward. And you hook them in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lyndee. Tanya, I know this. You teach data storytelling as a course. So, what has been your experience in this aspect, like talking about complementing stories with visuals?
You know, I wish I had the skill that Deepthy does. It's just so brilliant. I love the visuals. I love what Lyndee does with her slides too. But well, I'm just a storyteller, so not an expert in visualization. But what can people do? What are some low-hanging fruits? So, you know, for example, images. I loved the use of images that Lyndee had, and images are very powerful. So we say that, you know, go for images, but there's always the ethics of storytelling that comes in, especially in the social sector, that what is a good picture to show? Am I only doing it to evoke, you know, emotions and sort of influence people in a way that, you know, the deep pockets would probably give more money, etc. So there's always this conflict. I'm not getting into that, but sometimes just asking yourself, what images can you use? The second thing from a visual perspective that we do is, you know, become creative yourself. Start imagining, how would I understand it better? So I'll give you an example. Okay, so I was working with a foundation just day before yesterday, conducting a workshop. There were about 9 social sector organizations who are in their accelerator program. One of them had a data point, which is about 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic, you know, has been produced since the time manufacturing of plastics or synthetics began. Now, it's a really big number. I have no idea what 8.3 billion metric tons looks like. So if I had to figure out what a metric ton is, what the weight is, so I tried to, you know, figure how would I do it visually. So this is what we sort of worked out, you know, that imagine you're standing in front of an Empire State Building. And it has about 112 stories. Can you imagine how magnificent it looks? It's huge and it's so heavy. Now I want you to imagine 25,000 Empire State Buildings in New York put together. That's the amount of plastic which has been produced since then. For that, I don't need to put 25,000 Empire State Buildings. I can just put a visual of it and write down 25,000x. And I say so, and show a visual or a picture of a lot of plastic. Now, 30% of that plastic is something which is being used well. I'm not saying all plastic is bad. We use it, to construct homes, for sustainability as well, which is fantastic. But about 60% of it gets broken down into microplastics, which is in a terrible state. It finds its way into landfills, or it gets washed out to sea. And then you can transition into better narratives, better visuals. You can still get more pictures. You could show the picture of a sperm whale that washed up in Philippines just 3 weeks ago. And then you could show that, that there was so much of rubbish and debris which was found inside the whale. And that's what's happening to aquatic life. And if we want to get into fisheries, if we want to get into better, food production coming from the sea, better ecosystem, you can transition to so many things. The idea is that when you have better visuals and you complement it with good narratives, you're able to pivot to the better version of your story. The idea should be, how do I keep drifting and bringing people back to what my point is and what I want them to understand? And sometimes we have to segue by going to New York, or sometimes going somewhere else and getting that visual and getting people to experience it, because we have to strive for common ground. The biggest challenge today in data storytelling is numbers are not relatable, but stories are. So the first thing that any storyteller should do is look for establishing common ground. Am I speaking human language? Can people relate to it? Or am I talking on a plane here and they're over here and there's absolutely no connection? So look for connections, look for common ground. And third thing, if you would just allow me half a minute, Lyndee, I just want to appreciate the contrasting stories that you had. I love the three visuals, about is rape instigated? And that's a good conversation to have. Are all of the reported cases genuine cases? I think that's another very powerful technique that storytellers, even in data, should look for: contrast. Because every coin has two sides to it, and every story and every data has two sides to it. I loved it, by the way, Lyndee, of visuals. Thank you.
Yes, it was lovely. Yeah. So before we move on to Q&A, here's a request. How about all three of you share like one pearl of wisdom, when it comes to data storytelling? We'll start with Lyndee.
Measuringstuff.com is a great website. I was just quickly trying to figure out what it is, which will tell you, if you have 300 feet, or if you have, what is that? Is it eight buses? Then it becomes, this number that you don't know, like what is 20,000 feet of plastic. It's a great website if you want to try and visualize or humanize. My number one trick, and I have a visual for this if you want. So Rashi, if you want to go to visual number one, my number one thing, if I can impart anything to you, is to kind of sort of think about grandma, but humanize. Always think of the human element to anything. Visual Village Square is the website that I'm the director of. This is what, number one. Sorry, the first one. That's what it looked like about a year ago. Some great stories, really interesting, but those visuals aren't gonna like really rock your world, are they? Returned migrants take to smuggling for a want of livelihood. I want to see the migrant. I want that story to start with the migrant. I want to hear the human story. If you go to the next slide, you'll see how when you go to Village Square, we're all about people. We put people everywhere. All the visuals are going to have people in it. If you go to the next slide as well, you'll see this is a sample of some of our stories. We are all about trying to humanize, tell the human side of a story. If you go to the last slide, you'll see that our Instagram page is full of little nuggets. And by the way, we haven't talked about social media. That's a whole nother thing. But what is great about social media and what it has done for us is made us all very, very incisive, to the point, and visual. But coming back to my top tip is humanize. Whatever you can do, try and not only think of the human who's your audience member, but think of how you can get their attention. The way to get their attention is usually by telling a story about a human, because that's what we are. That's the human race. That's how we've progressed as far as we have. Thank you.
I would go with 3 tips. I just saw a chat bit on how do we convey negative information. I would say transparency. There are amazing ways in which you can say, I messed up, or, this has not come out in our research. Usually the sample size, is put in the smallest possible way when we want to kind of portray a generic behavior. So to me, transparency is key, to say that this was the pilot that we used, but this has key insights towards a behavioral pattern that we are seeing, etc. Second is try and build a relationship. The building that relationship of trust, it works both ways. So as a storyteller, if you feel, if the researchers feel that feel a sense of trust in the storyteller being able to hold that story together for them, that usually results in a far superior product as well, which which will definitely resonate with the audiences that you've meant it for. And I would say experiment, because the world of communication is changing so fast that there's no templates. I saw another couple of comments also which were asking for templates. There are no templates. Chuck the templates would be my tip. Look at each piece of research for itself, on its merits, and then figure out how you want that story to be told. Chuck the templates out of the window, develop a relationship of trust with your storyteller, and then, I feel it's smooth going from there. Tanya, over to you.
Thank you. What can I say after you've said what you've said, Deepthy? But I'll try to do justice. I'll say something that you had briefly mentioned up in the beginning, which is bite sizing of data. It's a brilliant technique. It simplifies numbers. And I'm still stuck on what Lyndee had shared about, about sexual harassment, about rapes, about the state of women in India. So imagine that you have to share slightly high numbers, and the number is that, Amnesty International published a few years ago that 33% of women in India experience some sort of sexual harassment every day. Now, 33%, you might be, it's something which is not, it doesn't connect very easily. Sitting in my safe space, which is my study, and all of us logged in from home through internet devices, we might be tempted to think that 33% is really far away. And it's not us, the people who are logged into this call. So how do I make this number relatable? It's bite sizing that helps. Just using fractions, using absolute numbers would be interesting. So replace 33% with, say, 3 out of 10 women in India experience it. And then add some powerful narrative to it. If I'm going to present it, say, to corporates, because I'm looking for, maybe creating safe spaces in corporate so that we can hire more women. And that's the agenda, that we want more women to join the workplace. I might say that it happens, this 3 out of 10 women experience sexual harassment when they're getting into the lift and out of it, and someone brushes past them and mumbles something incoherently. It can happen when they're taking public transport or taking company transport, and the man sitting next to them brushes his or her, his thigh against her and wouldn't remove it. It can happen when they're getting food from the cafeteria and someone wouldn't stop staring at them. So you can help people visualize in the space. So anchoring contextualization helps when you're using numbers. I can make it even smaller, and I could say there are 3 panelists today here. Incidentally, all 3 of them are women, Deepthy, Lyndee, and Tanya. What are the odds that before the day is out, one of us is going to experience something which is going to leave a bad taste in our mouth? Now, in an Indian context, if a lot of Indians are logged in here, you would also understand that some of us don't even go back and report it to our husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers, because the biggest solution is, the world is a very bad place. So quit your job and stay at home. And there goes our education, there goes our aspirations. So now how did I work with numbers? Simple, break down the number, bite size it. 33% is not relatable. 3 out of 10 is better. 1 out of 3 is even better. And when we bite size numbers, we can get to the better narrative. You can tell the better story and get people to imagine who those 1 out of 3 are. I hope that helps. Try using it.
Thank you, Tanya. That was amazing. So I think it's time we kind of jump to the Q&A. We have.
I think we've already been doing a Q&A in the chats.
That's true. That's true. That's true. But I just wanted to make this a little bit interactive. So why don't we unmute Manmeet? Manmeet, you can ask your question directly to our panel.
Hi Anubrata, hi Deepthy, Lyndee, and Tanya. It's been a great session, I must say that. So I have a very generic question. I think I even put it in the chat, but I still have this iota of doubt on myself that I come across so many. I've been working a lot on secondary data sets recently, and I've come across so many things which I think that I just cannot relate them with pictures. And just like I think Lyndee, you had mentioned, how do you picture something? How do you make it relatable? So what could be good sources? What all could be such sources of innovation or creativity to add to my PowerPoint for that matter, or reports? And also, where do I draw a line? Keep us, that's just the extent of creativity that I can put in, because I'm giving my presentation to, say, a board, and they're not really interested in the creativity, but they're interested in what conclusions have I drawn from the data.
I would say they are interested in creativity. They're going to stay listening if you are creative and you are compelling, and then they're going to draw conclusions from your data. You have to do both. But I think it would be, I'd need to know what your example is of what is the thing that you can't visualize to be able to give you a suggestion for that.
Manmeet, the way I would look at it is practice is what makes all of us perfect. So all of us have reached where we are because this is what we have been doing and honing our skills over a long period of time. I would recommend that you could look at courses that are of interest to you. This is something that I know for a fact. Anubrata is an inveterate course taker, so she's doing one course after the other. What these courses do, it's not about becoming the best at something, but it's exposing you to multiple things. So when you're a generalist and you guys are specialists, we are the generalists, and we bring in the prism of that, the general outlook. So to be able to see things as a generalist, all you need to do is keep looking for the general bits. And it could be through courses, it could be through, actually engaging with coaches like Tanya. Tanya is there, and I'm sure she's very happy to meet you over a chat to actually talk about, how to develop that lens.
Thank you, Deepthy. Thank you, Manmeet. I think we also have a couple of questions from Vikas.
Yeah, thanks, Anubrata. Thanks a lot, Tanya, Lyndee, and Anubrata and Deepthy. I think it was an excellent session. In fact, I could relate to it because yesterday I was the one who started the session in yesterday's plenary, and it started with "I am a storyteller." And now I do realize that I'm not a storyteller after hearing this session. But yeah, thanks for answering the question around the balance between numbers. And I think you've kind of put forward how we can do it in some excellent ways of doing that. My question is around, often I feel after even the set of questions that I was looking through in the chat box, I kind of reflect back on the training that we've received as researchers. I think a lot of it has to do with something about how we are trained into being a little bit more detached from the data, attached to your data, but detached in a different way of when you interpret it. And I think that's where I feel on reflecting back, some of the issues of communication and storytelling do not come naturally to us. So and I know, Lyndee, you've given us some of the tips. I'm going to certainly use not the grandmom, but the mother one for sure. But anything about how we can actually get this into a system of the research trainings that we have, or how when we start thinking research as a particular profession, that we can talk about communications, talk about storytelling, to talk about these things. Any reflections on that? Any experiences you've got in going to universities and telling them to people who are not as old as me and are still in the process of learning? Because I think people like us tend to take a little bit of time to unlearn and go back to some interesting ways of showing our work. Just a small thought on that.
One bit, Vikas, that I want to say, and I loved how you said that you've been trained to keep your emotions aside and look at numbers as numbers and look at data as data. In fact, it's an excellent advice when you're researching. It's a good idea to be balanced, to be unbiased, and collect the data and do the research judiciously. But so that people can connect your research, that's where the heart comes in, and a good story, and to be able to convey something, to move people, to nudge them to take action. It's important to find a connect with them at an emotional level. And nothing has changed in the world ever, nothing ever moved unless somebody felt strongly for it. The best ideas, the best recommendations are pushed aside, and people say, no, it's a good one, but let's revisit this in 6 months or next year. It's not prioritized because people don't feel the burn. In fact, we work with the Amani Institute, and they are present all over the world. They're people who are change makers, who attend their courses to do things well. And Amani Institute has this amazing word that all the change makers use. It's called find your burn. And every conversation, every project that they pick up, they're always looking for the burn, because unless you burn for it, unless you feel for it, and unless you can make others feel for it, you cannot bring about a change. And the entire responsibility of a researcher is, of course, to do the research judiciously by keeping the emotions aside. But when you want to convey that information, bring the heart in. You cannot not do with the heart there. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Tanya. That was amazing. Feel the burn. Right, and also a question from Ramanshu. Can you unmute Ramanshu?
Thanks for this brilliant session, Tanya, Lyndee, Deepthy. It was really exciting, and it was really enriching. Actually, going back to the fact that as researchers, communication is a very, very critical point, and how do we communicate is very critical. How do we bring out the essence of the story? But as evaluators, the challenge that we often face is to, Tanya, as you were mentioning, bringing a heart out in the story. But sometimes while communicating, sometimes it's expected of us that we are keeping that distance from while communicating also. We are being impersonal while communicating also. Especially the question that I put out. So as scientific researchers, maybe do we run the risk of when we bring the story out with our heart in it, do we run the risk of perhaps losing the credibility of the methodology or the rigor that was brought in? And if not, how do we balance both of these? Because at one end we do have a scientific responsibility of communicating our results out, but at the other end it's also important to get the developmental story out.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I'm sure that's a question that must have popped into so many people, but nobody asked that, and you did, and it would answer that question for so many other people. So when we are sharing our stories, are we becoming emotional while sharing our stories? No, that's not the point. The idea is to evoke emotions through stories in others, and you could be completely formal detached presenter as well, or speak the way you speak. It doesn't matter, but it's not about getting overwhelmed with your own emotions and then telling the story. So I think that's one clarity that we should get, that it's not about me feeling it. It's about me being able to evoke emotions in others enough and to show them who that number belongs to. I'll give you an example, okay? So this research is freely available. So when Save the Children was trying to, gauge what would help them raise funds for the betterment and well-being of children in Africa. So they did a study, and they partnered with Wharton, the University of Pennsylvania. And they said, hey, let's help us figure out what will help us raise more funds, because when they were sharing a lot of data, numbers, etc., people were not contributing and giving enough funds. So Wharton said happily, gladly. So they got 2 test groups of students, group A, group B. When group A came in for the study, they were given data, numbers, infographics. For example, 3.1 million children in Africa suffer from 2, 3, 4 deprivations, etc., etc. All the people who participated in the first group, in the first study, they were given $5 each as a just to express their gratitude. Thank you for participating in the study. When they exited the room, there was a deposit box by Save the Children. A volunteer asked, hey, you just attended this presentation and this, you heard about the problems in Africa. Would you like to contribute for it? You know how a lot of us, we would like to pocket the note, take out some loose change and put it in the deposit box. People did that. Fast forward to the second group coming in. They attended the presentation and the brochures that they received. The first 2 pages were dedicated to the story of a 7-year-old girl in Mali. Her name was Rokia. It talked about what her day looks like, how her life would change with the contribution which was made, etc., followed by the same numbers, 3.1 million children in Africa, etc. These people too were given $5 each for participating in the study. When they moved out, they too were asked, would you like to deposit for the cost? People put some change. When the money was counted, amazingly, the difference between people who contributed by just attending data, infographics, etc., that kind of presentation and brochure, they contributed on an average half of what people who had heard Rokia's story contributed. Twice as much, because story will always beat facts. It always drives decisions. It helps us contextualize, understand, visualize, and then want to do something. I hope I answered that question for you, Himanshu.
I was just going to say, I couldn't agree more. And that's why you have to think, who is your audience and what is your mission? If your audience is to raise funds, then yes, you're going to really pour even more emotion and stories. If your audience is just to show people you've created this, you've done this amazing research and the findings are a little surprising or they're ABC or XYZ, what we're saying is not you have to put a story in everywhere. We're saying if you want people to pay attention to you and to read that data, make it easy for them. The whole thing doesn't have to be a novel or a story, but pepper your report with stories, and they're going to remember that data a lot more. And then they'll act on it. What is it? Who's your audience and what do you want from them? That's how you can pitch how you tell your story, what story you tell.
Yeah, and I think formats matter. So, like I was saying, Ramanshu, the main report can stay with all of its, all the aspects that you've put in, and it can be a 300-page, very explicit report. But there are multiple ways of using key findings in smaller versions. So if you use the same report and create it in, say, 4 versions.
I would just like to thank Tanya, Lyndee, and Deepthy over here. The 3 points that both of you mentioned, Tanya, the contextualization of the story, that's actually very critical. And Lyndee, how do we actually respond to the audience? And I think that's something that we have learned from you a lot. The number of reports that you've edited for us, that's great. And I take a note of Deepthy's point of the formats. Perhaps separate your formats according to the audience.
Thank you guys. So this was great, and here are my key takeaways from the session. That data storytelling sits at the intersection of science and art. There's certainly some science to it, such as best practices and guidelines to follow, but there's also an artistic component, which is why it's so much fun, and it is inherently diverse. Different people will approach things in different ways and come up with different solutions to the same data storytelling challenges. As we have discussed, there is no single right answer. Rather, there are often multiple potential paths for communicating effectively with data. The ideal narrative in a data story has a balance of sizzle and steak and a balance between why and how within the story, because we need to be telling a compelling story, which is also technically true and accurate. We also need to start thinking about data at an organizational level rather than an individual level, because analytics is not just a personal skill, it's an organizational skill. Instead of the individual analyst, we need to build a community of practice where different aspects of our skills and commitment come together. So keep your grandmother in mind and feel the burn. Thank you, Deepthy, Lyndee, Tanya, for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and experience. A beautiful audience, thank you for your time and investment in the conclave. Our very own people at Sambodhi, super grateful for your support. You are amazing. Kultan and Swapnil, thank you for helping us conceptualize this. The conclave wouldn't have been possible without your vision. Also, a super cool team, Kamala, Rashi, Ankita, Yashika, and Tarun. Thanks so much for your hard work. This has been a great 3 days. We'll be back again with another exciting session. Also, on that note, we have an important announcement. Global Evaluation Initiative, in association with its local and global partners, is organizing the 2022 Global Evaluation Week between May 30th and June 3. Sambodhi is not only participating in local, but also co-organization in 2 sessions and also kind of participating in 5 overall. So we'll be sharing the details with you shortly. Do keep an eye out on our social media pages. Until then, stay safe, take good care, share your stories, data or otherwise, and don't forget to tag us. Bye-bye now.